The year is 1944, a world at war. On a desolate Pacific atoll, amidst the shattered remains of a Japanese bunker, a lone Marine, weary and caked in mud, sifts through the rubble. He finds a small, unassuming black bag. It's a woman's purse, stained with dirt and blood. He opens it, his fingers trembling, expecting to find a keepsake, a memento of a lost love. What he finds instead is a simple folded piece of paper. The paper, a medical discharge form, bears the name of a nurse he remembers, a quiet woman with a gentle smile who served alongside them, tending to their wounds, her presence a beacon of hope in the chaos. And then, at the bottom of the bag, he finds it. It's not a diary, not a locket. It's a small, heavy object wrapped in a faded silk handkerchief. He unwraps it, his breath catching in his throat. The light catches the glint of gold, the unmistakable shape of a star. It's the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States, and it belonged to the quiet nurse with the gentle smile. The salt-laden air of the Pacific Ocean clung to Lieutenant June Carter like a second skin. It was a constant, humid reminder of how far she was from her Indiana farm, a world away from the familiar scent of fresh-cut hay and the gentle hum of cicadas on a summer night. Here, on a tiny forgotten speck of land in the vast blue expanse, the symphony of her life was replaced by the guttural roar of artillery and the incessant chatter of a field hospital struggling to keep pace with the relentless tide of war. June was not what the Marines expected. She was not the boisterous, wisecracking dame from the movies. She was a ghost in the chaos. A quiet presence with hands that moved with an almost ethereal grace. She spoke little, her words reserved for her patients, a soft word of encouragement, a gentle promise of a better tomorrow. Her smile, a rare and fleeting curve of her lips, was a phenomenon. The Marines, a tough and cynical bunch, found themselves drawn to it, a momentary reprieve from the grim reality of their existence. To them, she was simply the quiet nurse. They saw her as an angel of mercy, a woman of gentle hands and a compassionate heart, but they never saw the fire that burned beneath her serene exterior. Her days were a blur of tourniquets and plasma, of whispered prayers and silent tears. She moved from cot to cot, her uniform perpetually stained with the marks of her profession, her eyes weary but unwavering. She learned to read the unspoken language of the wounded, the subtle shifts in their breathing, the silent pleas in their eyes. She knew which men were clinging to life by a thread and which had already begun their journey home. One afternoon, a young Marine, no older than 19, was brought in, his leg shattered by shrapnel. His name was Corporal Thomas Riley, and his face was a mask of pain and fear. As June tended to his wounds, he confessed his terror not of death, but of being forgotten. He spoke of his family, his little sister, and his dream of becoming a mechanic. June listened, her hands working tirelessly, her eyes never leaving his. She told him about her farm, about the stubborn rooster who refused to wake with the sun, about the smell of rain on dry earth. She spoke of simple things, of home and hope, and as she did, the fear in his eyes began to recede. He wasn't just a casualty, a number in the great ledger of war. He was Tom, the future mechanic. She became a keeper of secrets, a repository of fears and dreams. The men she cared for poured out their hearts to her, their vulnerabilities laid bare in the sterile confines of the field hospital. They trusted her with their last words, their promises to loved ones, their deepest regrets. She carried their burdens, a silent, unwavering pillar of strength. The front lines were a brutal master, and a fresh wave of casualties began to flood the hospital. The sounds of battle grew closer, a constant, menacing hum on the horizon. The weary doctors and nurses worked around the clock, their movements a synchronized dance of desperation and efficiency. Amidst the chaos, a new patient was brought in, a grizzled sergeant with a haunted look in his eyes. He had been a scout, and his unit had been ambushed. He spoke of a Japanese assault, a cunning and brutal attack from a hidden flank. His words sent a chill through the entire hospital. The enemy was not just out there, they were closing in. And as the sounds of small arms fire began to pepper the air, June felt the familiar pang of fear. She had always been able to control it, to push it down and focus on her duty. But this time it was different. This time the fear was not for herself, but for the men she had come to think of as her brothers. The gentle, quiet nurse was about to be pushed to her limits, and as the first mortar shell screamed overhead, she knew her life, and the lives of those around her, would never be the same. The mortar shell exploded with a deafening roar, shaking the ground and sending a shower of dirt and debris over the field hospital. The rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound of battle that had defined their lives for months was now right on top of them, a monstrous symphony of destruction. Panic, a cold and primal beast, threatened to seize the camp. The wounded, already teetering on the edge, cried out in fear. The doctors and nurses, their faces pale, looked at each other with a silent, shared terror. But in the midst of the chaos, June Carter remained an anchor. Her movements, already precise, became even more deliberate, more focused. Her quiet voice cut through the noise, a calm and steady command to her orderlies, to the panicked young Marines around her. "Secure the perimeter," she shouted, a surprising force in her tone. "Get the litters ready. We're not leaving anyone behind!" The Japanese assault was swift and brutal. They swarmed the position from the jungle, a wave of green and steel, their shouts a chilling counterpoint to the staccato rhythm of American rifle fire. The field hospital, a symbol of hope and healing, was now a front-line battleground. The doctors, many of them reservists with little combat experience, scrambled for rifles and sidearms. The nurses, trained for tending to wounds, were now facing the source of them. A young private, his arm in a sling, grabbed a rifle and took up a position behind a stack of supply crates, his hands trembling. June moved to his side, her eyes scanning the tree line. "Private," she said, her voice low and steady. "Do you see that tree line?" He nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "That's where they're coming from. Don't waste your shots. Wait for a clear target." Her words were not a command, but a simple, practical piece of advice, a testament to a knowledge of combat that no one had ever suspected she possessed. The Marines, fighting a desperate rearguard action, were falling back, their ranks thinning. The wounded continued to pour in, but now they were accompanied by the sounds of close-quarters combat. A Japanese soldier, bayonet fixed, broke through the perimeter and charged toward the first aid tent. The private June had spoken to froze, his rifle useless in his shaking hands. June, without hesitation, grabbed a scalpel from her supply kit. It was a small, almost insignificant blade against a soldier and a bayonet, but she held it like a weapon of war, not a tool of healing. Before the soldier could reach the tent, a Marine's rifle shot rang out and he crumpled to the ground. June didn't even flinch. She simply returned to her patient, her face a mask of cold resolve. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. The hospital, with its makeshift tents and supplies, was a flimsy fortress. The doctors and nurses, their skills for healing put on hold, fought with a desperate ferocity. June, her uniform now torn and stained with blood that was not her own, moved through the chaos, her scalpel and her wits her only weapons. She helped set up barricades, she barked orders, she even dragged a wounded Marine to safety under a hail of gunfire. The quiet nurse with the gentle smile was gone. In her place was a warrior, a woman forged in the crucible of combat. As the sun began to set, the Japanese assault faltered, then receded. The jungle grew silent again, a deep and terrifying silence. The aftermath was a scene of carnage and despair. The ground was littered with bodies, both American and Japanese. The tents were shredded, the medical supplies scattered and ruined. But the hospital had held. They had survived the storm. June stood among the ruins, her face streaked with dirt and blood, her eyes full of a profound and weary sadness. She looked at the faces of the Marines she had fought alongside, the men who had only known her as a compassionate caregiver. Their expressions were a mixture of awe and confusion. They had seen a side of her they never knew existed, a hidden reservoir of courage and combat skill. She had not only tended to their wounds, she had fought beside them, defended them. And as a young private looked at her with a dawning realization in his eyes, he whispered, "Who are you?" But before she could answer, the silence was broken by a single terrifying word from the jungle's edge. "Banzai!" The Japanese, it seemed, were not yet finished. The second wave of the Japanese assault was not a full-scale charge, but a focused, tactical strike. They came not to overrun the entire hospital, but to eliminate its command, its most critical resources. Their target was the central command tent, a canvas structure where the last remaining medical supplies and a shortwave radio were located. The small band of American survivors, exhausted and low on ammunition, knew they could not withstand another prolonged attack. They had fought off the first wave, but their luck was running out. As the Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle, a Marine sergeant, his face a mask of grim determination, rallied the men. "We hold the line," he roared, his voice hoarse from shouting. "We protect the radio. We send a message or we die trying." June, standing beside him, her rifle gripped tightly in her hand, simply nodded. She had a plan, a desperate last-ditch effort to buy them time. "Sergeant," she said, her voice calm amidst the growing clamor of the enemy's advance. "They're not just coming for us. They're coming for the supplies. We have to draw them away from the tent." The sergeant looked at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. "And how do we do that, Lieutenant?" he asked, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "We're almost out of ammo and half of us are walking wounded." June's eyes, hardened by the horrors she had seen, scanned the battlefield. "We create a diversion," she said. "We make them think the main force is somewhere else. We lead them into the old mortar pits." She pointed to a series of collapsed trenches and shell craters not far from their position. "If we can draw them in there, we can funnel their advance. It'll give us a chance to get a message out." The sergeant hesitated. It was a risky, almost suicidal plan. It would require a small, dedicated group to leave the relative safety of the hospital's perimeter and become bait. He looked at the faces of the remaining Marines, and he saw their exhaustion, their fear. He knew he couldn't ask any of them to do it. But before he could refuse, June spoke again. "I'll do it," she said, her voice as firm as a rock. "I know this area. I've been here long enough to know every trench, every crater. I'll take a couple of men. We'll draw them away. You get that message out." The sergeant's objections died on his lips. He knew he couldn't stop her. He had already seen what she was capable of. She was no longer just the quiet nurse. She was a warrior, a leader. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her courage. "All right, Lieutenant," he said. "Get a couple of men and get ready. And for God's sake, be careful." June chose 2 young Marines, both of whom had been her patients and had seen her in action. They were scared, but their respect for her was absolute. She handed them what little ammunition they had left and told them to follow her, to stay low, and to not fire until she gave the command. They moved like ghosts through the shattered landscape, a silent, desperate trio. As the Japanese began to close in, June fired her rifle into the air, a single, defiant shot. The sound echoed across the battlefield, a clear signal. The Japanese, thinking they had found their target, diverted their advance, their bloodlust now focused on the source of the gunfire. June and her 2 Marines led them on a harrowing chase, darting from trench to crater, firing a single well-placed shot here and there to keep their attention. The plan was working. They were drawing the enemy away, buying time for the men back at the hospital to get the radio working. But their luck was about to run out. As they rounded a corner of a deep, flooded crater, they were met by a group of Japanese soldiers who had outflanked them. It was a deadly trap. The 2 young Marines, their rifles empty, went down in a hail of gunfire. June, alone, her back against a crater wall, faced the enemy. Her rifle was empty, but she held her ground, her face a mask of defiant resolve. She was ready to die, to make her last stand. But just as the first Japanese soldier raised his rifle to fire, a series of explosions ripped through the air. The sound of American reinforcements, a long-awaited miracle, echoed across the battlefield. The Japanese, caught between 2 forces, were forced to retreat, their plan to overrun the hospital thwarted. June, bruised and exhausted but alive, sank to the ground, her body trembling with a mixture of relief and sorrow. The last stand had been successful, but at a terrible cost. And as the American troops arrived, she looked at the bodies of the 2 young Marines she had led into battle, their faces serene in death, and a single silent tear rolled down her cheek. The battle was over, but the war, for her, was just beginning. She had survived, but her secret had been laid bare, her true self exposed, and she knew she could never go back to being just the quiet nurse with the gentle smile. In the aftermath of the battle, the Pacific sun rose on a changed landscape. The field hospital, once a beacon of order amidst the chaos, was now a somber collection of torn tents and makeshift graves. The sounds of war had been replaced by the quiet hum of recovery. Reinforcements had arrived, bringing with them a fresh wave of supplies and medical personnel. The survivors, a small and hardened band, were now an anomaly, a testament to a battle that should have been lost. Among the new arrivals was a high-ranking officer, a no-nonsense colonel who had heard the reports of the hospital's heroic defense. He was a man of cold logic and military protocol, and he wanted answers. He saw the exhausted Marines, the traumatized doctors, and finally, he saw Lieutenant June Carter. He had read the reports that spoke of a nurse who had not only tended to the wounded, but had led a diversionary tactic, a suicidal gambit that had saved the entire unit. He looked at her, at the small, unassuming woman with the haunted eyes and the silent demeanor, and he could not reconcile the soldier he had read about with the quiet nurse standing before him. "Lieutenant Carter," he said, his voice a low growl. "The reports say you showed exceptional bravery under fire, that you led a combat action. Is that correct?" June, still reeling from the events of the night before, simply nodded. She had no words for what she had done, for the lives she had taken, for the lives she had saved. "And where did you learn to do that, Lieutenant?" The colonel pressed, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Nurses are not trained for combat. Your file says you're a registered nurse from a farming town in Indiana. It says nothing about combat training. So I'll ask you again. Who are you?" The question hung in the humid air, a stark and unforgiving interrogation. The Marines who had fought alongside her, the men who had seen her courage firsthand, watched in a silent, tense crowd. They had their own questions, their own quiet awe. They wanted to know the truth behind the gentle hands and the steely resolve. June, for the first time, looked the colonel in the eye. "Sir," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I am a nurse, and I did my duty." The colonel was not satisfied. He ordered her to be taken to a secure location, a small dusty tent set apart from the others, for a formal debriefing. He saw her not as a hero, but as an enigma, a potential liability. He couldn't understand her. He couldn't place her. And what he couldn't understand, he was suspicious of. In the solitude of the tent, June was left with her memories. The faces of the men she had lost, the sound of the rifle fire, the feel of the mud and the blood on her hands. The quiet nurse was gone, and she wasn't sure who was left in her place. She had been a caregiver, a healer, but she had become a killer, a survivor. The two parts of her, once so separate, had merged in the crucible of war, leaving her with a new and terrifying identity. She was no longer just a nurse. She was a soldier, days turned into weeks. The formal debriefing became an unofficial interrogation. The colonel, obsessed with unraveling her secret, pressed her on her past, on her training, on her motivations. He even questioned the reports of her heroism, suggesting they were exaggerated, a product of battlefield hysteria. He saw her silence not as humility, but as a deliberate act of concealment. One day he came to the tent with a new document, a single, crisp piece of paper. He placed it on the table between them. It was a formal recommendation for a Medal of Honor, written by the sergeant who had fought alongside her. The highest military honor reserved for those who had shown gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. The colonel's voice, usually so clipped and authoritative, was now laced with a cold, mocking tone. "This is what they want to give you, Lieutenant," he said, tapping the paper, "for what you did. But I won't sign it. Not until I know who you are. Until you tell me the truth." June looked at the paper, the words a silent testament to the courage she had been forced to summon. She looked at the colonel, at his hard, unforgiving face. She knew he would not stop. She knew he would not rest until he had the answer to his question. She had a choice to make. She could continue to be silent, to protect the secret that had defined her life for so long, or she could tell the truth, to reveal the hidden history that had brought her to this desolate island. A history that would change the way everyone, including the cynical colonel, saw her forever. And as she reached into her bag, not for a medical instrument, but for a simple, folded piece of paper. She knew her silence was about to be broken, and the full weight of her past was about to be unleashed. The paper June withdrew from her bag was not a military document. It was a faded, creased photograph, a picture of a young man in a Marine Corps uniform, his face full of a boyish charm and a quiet strength that mirrored her own. She held it out to the colonel, her hand trembling slightly. "This is my brother, sir," she said, her voice a low, raspy whisper. "First Lieutenant Robert Carter. He was a Marine. He was killed on Guadalcanal. I found his body myself." The colonel's expression didn't change. He simply looked at the photograph, then back at her. "I'm sorry for your loss, Lieutenant," he said, his tone devoid of any real empathy. "But what does this have to do with your combat experience?" June's eyes, filled with a profound and ancient sorrow, stared past him, a window into a past he could never comprehend. "He was a scout, sir." "He was good at it. He taught me how to read a map, how to set a perimeter, how to move through the jungle without a sound. We grew up on a farm, sir. He always said the farm taught you how to read the land, and the land could teach you how to survive a war." The colonel's face remained impassive. "That's a nice story, Lieutenant. But a few pointers from your brother don't explain what you did out there. A few lessons from a farming town don't make you a soldier." June's gaze hardened. "No, sir, they don't. But what happened to my brother did. I found him in a ravine, sir. He had been ambushed. I found his body, and I found his diary. He wrote about the men he had lost, about the fear, about the overwhelming odds. He wrote about the hope of getting a message out, about the desperate hope that someone would come. They didn't. They were forgotten, and that's what I couldn't let happen here. That's why I did what I did. I couldn't let them be forgotten." Her words were a torrent of raw emotion, a dam of grief that had finally broken. She had been carrying the weight of her brother's memory, of his last stand, of his unfulfilled mission. She had seen the same desperation in the eyes of the Marines at the hospital, and she had refused to let their story end the same way. She had become her brother, a soldier in a nurse's uniform, fighting not just for their lives, but for his memory. The colonel's cold facade finally began to crack. He was a man of logic, but her words were not about logic. They were about a love so profound it had transcended the boundaries of life and death. He saw the fire in her eyes, a fire that had been forged in the crucible of loss. "I still don't understand, Lieutenant," he said, his voice now a little softer. "What did you do? What did you find?" June reached into her bag again, her hand moving with a quiet, deliberate grace. She withdrew a small, heavy object wrapped in a faded silk handkerchief. She laid it on the table between them, and slowly, carefully, she unwrapped it. The light of the tent caught the glint of gold, the unmistakable shape of a star. It was the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. But it was not a new medal, not a symbol of the courage she had just shown. It was old, tarnished, and etched with the words, "For gallantry at Guadalcanal." And then, in a place he could not have seen from his position, she pointed to a small, almost invisible inscription on the back. It was her brother's name. The colonel stared at the medal, then at June, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. He had read the reports of the battle on Guadalcanal, of the scout who had fought a desperate, heroic rearguard action to save his men. The Medal of Honor had been recommended, but the scout's body had never been found. The medal, it was assumed, had been lost to the jungle. Until now, June's secret was not that she was a soldier. It was that she was the keeper of a fallen soldier's legacy, the last link to a heroism that had been lost to history. She had not only inherited her brother's courage, but his mission. And as the colonel looked at the quiet nurse with the gentle smile, he finally understood. He had not been interviewing a hero. He had been interviewing a ghost, a living testament to the unfulfilled promise of a brother's last stand, a sister's desperate fight to ensure that his sacrifice and his courage would never be forgotten. And as a single, quiet tear rolled down the colonel's cheek, he knew he had to sign the recommendation, not just for her, but for a memory that had been waiting to be honored for years. The quiet nurse had just unveiled her past, and in doing so she had revealed a deeper, more profound heroism than anyone had ever imagined. But the war was not over, and her journey, she knew, was far from its end. The news of Lieutenant June Carter's Medal of Honor nomination and the revelation of her brother's posthumous medal swept through the Marines like a tidal wave. She was no longer the quiet nurse. She was now the ghost of Guadalcanal, a living legend. The cynical colonel, a changed man, signed the recommendation and sent it up the chain of command with a heartfelt personal note. The men who had fought alongside her, the men who had once only seen a quiet caregiver, now saw her with a new and profound respect. She was their angel of mercy, their warrior, their sister in arms. The war, however, was far from over. The Marines were preparing for their next major offensive, an invasion of the heavily fortified Japanese mainland. The fighting on the islands had been brutal, but the generals knew the true test would be on Japanese soil. The casualty estimates were staggering, and the need for a new type of soldier, a new kind of leader, was becoming clear. June's story, her unique blend of compassion and combat skill, had caught the attention of the highest echelons of the Marine Corps. She had proven that a different kind of heroism was possible, a heroism that did not sacrifice empathy for efficiency. A new order came down, a command that bypassed all military protocol and convention. Lieutenant June Carter, now a celebrated war hero, was to be immediately reassigned. She was to be the commander of a new experimental unit, a Special Operations Medical Detachment. Their mission was to be the first in, to provide immediate medical aid to the most forward units, and to be prepared to defend their position at any cost. It was a role that was almost unheard of, a hybrid of medic and soldier. The unit would be a mix of Marines and nurses, a small, highly trained group designed to operate behind enemy lines, to provide a beacon of hope in the heart of the storm. June met with the men and women who would serve under her, a motley crew of battle-hardened Marines and fearless nurses. They were all volunteers, all drawn to her story, to the myth and the reality of her courage. She stood before them, not in a crisp new uniform, but in the same faded, worn-out one she had been wearing for months. She held the Medal of Honor, the one that had belonged to her brother, and she held it not as a trophy, but as a promise. "This is not for me," she said, her voice clear and strong. "This is for my brother. And it is a reminder that we will never leave anyone behind. We are the last stand. We are the ones who will go into the fire to bring our brothers and sisters home. We are the ones who will not forget." She looked at the faces of her new unit, and she saw not just soldiers and nurses, but a family, a small, defiant group who were ready to face the impossible. She was no longer just the keeper of her brother's legacy. She was now the embodiment of it. She was the ghost of Guadalcanal, and she was about to lead her new family into the heart of a new war, a war that would be even more brutal, even more unforgiving than the one they had just survived. And as they prepared for the journey, a new chapter of her life and a new chapter in the history of the United States Marine Corps was about to begin. The quiet nurse with the gentle smile was no longer an enigma. She was a legend, and her story, a story of love, loss, and a courage that transcended all expectations, was about to be written in the blood and fire of a new battlefield. She was about to lead her unit into the jaws of a new war, and as the last of her gear was packed, and the ships began to move out to sea, she looked to the horizon, a horizon filled with the promise of a battle that would either define her or destroy her. She was heading into the next chapter of the war, a new and terrifying chapter where the lines between medic and soldier, life and death, would be blurred forever. She was about to embark on the most dangerous mission of her life, a mission that would test her resolve and courage to their very limits, a mission that would determine not only her fate but the fate of the war itself. The quiet nurse had found her purpose, and her new war, she knew, was just beginning. And this time, the stakes were higher than ever before.